She stood barefoot on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, her reflection still damp from the steam of the morning shower. In the mirror, Dorothy Stratten adjusted the thin strap of her blouse. The fabric clung to her skin, light blue against pale gold, and for a moment she looked not at herself, but through herself. Her eyes lingered, as if something just behind the glass held her attention more than her own face ever could. It was August, 1980. The air outside in Los Angeles was heavy with heat, the kind of heat that warped time, slowed everything down, made decisions feel heavier. Dorothy was 20 years old, a girl from Vancouver turned Playmate of the Year. She had conquered what millions only dreamed of, but in the stillness of that mirror, the cracks had already begun to spread. That morning, her last morning, she had left a note by the telephone. It was short, a reminder to call someone. She had plans that day. She was supposed to meet her estranged husband, Paul Snyder. He said it would be just to talk. He said he understood. She brought flowers with her. The mirror would be the last to see her leave the apartment alive. It reflected a woman who had learned to hold herself perfectly, the tilt of the chin, the softened jaw, the poised restraint in her eyes. But mirrors don't lie, they just don't speak. Later, when the police would walk through the house on South Linden Avenue, they would stop at that same mirror. It was splashed in sunlight, untouched, the only clean surface in a room otherwise drenched in horror. One of the officers would pause before it, just a moment too long, then walk away without a word. Mirrors, after all, are quiet witnesses. Dorothy's story begins with beauty, but not the kind that simply dazzles. Hers was the beauty that drew in longing, obsession, projection. In her short life, she was seen through many eyes as a muse, a conquest, a daughter, a starlet, a salvation. Everyone looked at her. Few truly saw her. By the time she stood in that bathroom, Dorothy had become a symbol. But symbols are easy to destroy. She'd once said she wanted to be more than a model. She wanted to act, to write, maybe even direct. But everything in her life was already being directed by men with louder voices and longer shadows. There was something else in that bathroom. To the quiet hum of a wall clock, it ticked steadily, indifferent to what was coming. In retrospect, it's cruel how ordinary everything seemed. The sun rose, coffee brewed, a neighbor walked their dog. Somewhere in the city, a casting director added her name to a list, all while the clock kept moving. Toward the hour her story would end. Some say she should have seen it coming, that she underestimated Paul, that her kindness was her flaw. But that's too simple. Kindness isn't a weakness. Sometimes, it's a weight, especially when the person receiving it mistakes it for permission. What would Dorothy have seen? Had she looked longer in that mirror, would she have noticed the trembling in her own shoulders, the instinct tucked behind her calm expression? Or had she already accepted that the cost of fame was silence? There's a cruel symmetry in the finality of her last reflection. A girl who had been endlessly photographed, whose image had been reproduced across calendars and magazines, reduced now to a private moment that no one recorded. No photographer, no flash, just her, alone, face to face with what she would never escape. Later, much later, her younger sister would describe Dorothy as someone too gentle for the life she was pushed into. That gentleness, that vulnerability in a violent world, would come to define how she was remembered. Not as a body in a crime scene, but as a presence. Lingering, elusive, unfinished. The mirror never shattered. It stayed intact, cold, honest. A silent witness to the last time Dorothy Stratten saw herself whole. Before the flashbulbs, before the mansion, before the endless interviews that asked her to smile a little wider, there was just a girl scooping ice cream on a quiet street in Vancouver. She wore a pale pink uniform, her golden hair tied back neatly, her tone always polite. Dorothy Ruth Hughes Stratten, still going by her real name, was 17, soft-spoken, and working at a Dairy Queen on East Hastings Street, the kind of place where the air always smelled of syrup, and teenagers filled plastic booths with half-whispered dreams. She didn't stand out at first, not in the way people later claimed. There were no trumpets, no gasps when she walked in. She was simply lovely in a quiet way, her beauty folding in on itself like the tip of a flower not yet opened. It took someone else to sharpen that softness into something marketable, someone with a hungrier eye. Paul Snider had already been watching. He arrived in a flashy car, wore cologne like armor, and smiled too often without blinking. A self-proclaimed promoter and king of the strip clubs, Paul was the kind of man who turned up where ambition outpaced wisdom. He carried Polaroids in his coat pocket bent at the corners, smudged with fingerprints images of girls who had once believed he could make them famous. He knew how to flatter, how to hover, how to wait. Dorothy was young, her family, working class. Her father had left when she was small, and her mother worked long hours. Dorothy helped care for her younger siblings. She wasn't the kind of girl who sought attention, but she didn't run from it either. When Paul walked in that first afternoon, something about his certainty made her pause. He complimented her voice, not just her looks, asked her if she'd ever thought about modeling, left a business card with a gold star sticker on it. He returned the next day, and the next. Eventually, Dorothy agreed to a photo shoot. It was modest, she thought. Just for fun. Something to try. She posed in a field, then by a staircase, then later in lingerie. She didn't understand how fast her image would be passed around. One of those early Polaroids would become the seed of her stardom and the soil of her undoing. Paul sent the photos to Playboy. He called the editors repeatedly. He used his charm like a crowbar. Finally, a reply came. They were interested. Dorothy was invited to Los Angeles for a test shoot. The two of them left Vancouver together. There's something almost mythic in how the next chapter unfolded. Like a dream filmed in soft focus. The mansion in Holmby Hills, the infinity pools and champagne fountains, girls walking barefoot across Persian rugs. Dorothy, taller now in heels, her skin shimmering under the glow of rented chandeliers. She was crowned Miss August 1979, and just months later, Playmate of the Year 1980. The transformation was sudden, but not complete. Beneath the platinum blonde and polished poses, the girl who once worked behind a counter still lingered a little shy, a little unsure. She wrote letters home in neat cursive, describing the strange new world she was learning to navigate. In one, she asked her mother if she should be worried about the things Paul said when he drank. In another, she mentioned that she'd been acting in a low-budget film and felt proud, even if the script was terrible. There's a particular photograph from this time one not published in any centerfold. In it, Dorothy is sitting on a wooden stool beside a window. The light slants across her face. She isn't smiling, not exactly. Her eyes seem distant, as if searching for something outside the frame. A breeze plays with a strand of her hair. Behind her, slightly out of focus, Paul watches, always watching. As Dorothy's fame grew, Paul became more controlling. He insisted on being her manager, her protector, her gateway to every room she entered. But the Playboy world didn't want him. He wasn't refined enough, not polished. Dorothy began to attend events alone. Doors opened for her now and began to close for him. But this was still the beginning, the soft part of the story. Before the shadows lengthened, before Dorothy understood that the very man who claimed to discover her was building a cage around her, one golden bar at a time. In the end, it's hard not to look back at those early photos and see them differently. The smile a little too tight, the hands a little too posed, the Polaroids still bent at the corners, whispering of a girl who thought she was stepping into a dream but was already standing on the edge of something terrible. Sometimes, the most dangerous stories begin with a compliment. The mansion looked like a fantasy carved out of illusion. Ivy snaked along the stone facade. Fountains whispered in hidden courtyards, and at night, the chandeliers glowed like stars hanging too low. For most who entered its gates, it was a shrine to fame and desire. But for Dorothy Stratten, it was both an awakening and a warning dressed in silk. When she first arrived, Dorothy had been quiet, almost hesitant. The other girls noticed. She didn't push to the front of the line. She answered questions with politeness, not bravado. But Hugh Hefner noticed too. And in Dorothy, he saw more than just another playmate. He called her the next Marilyn. Dorothy became Playmate of the Month in August 1979. The photos were soft-focus masterpieces, her body tastefully framed, her smile both innocent and knowing. She was celebrated not just for her beauty, but for something rarer, an emotional vulnerability that translated on camera. It was as if she couldn't hide anything, even if she tried, and Hefner believed she was different. He introduced her to directors, agents, producers, gave her access to a world beyond the pages of a magazine. He said she had real potential not just to decorate men's fantasies, but to shape her own future. It was a promise that glimmered like gold, but promises in Hollywood are always conditional. Dorothy began to change, not drastically, but distinctly. She stood straighter. She laughed more freely. Her clothes shifted from soft pastels to bolder cuts. In photographs, her eyes looked directly into the lens, no longer flinching. She was still gentle, but now she was aware. She also began acting first in minor roles, then in films like Galaxina and They All Laughed, where she starred alongside Audrey Hepburn's son, directed by Peter Bogdanovich. Dorothy was still learning, still raw, but there was something watchable about her, something unfinished, and therefore magnetic. Meanwhile, Paul Snider watched from the sidelines. Hefner had banned him from the mansion. Staff were instructed to keep him out, politely, but firmly. He had become an embarrassment, too loud, too controlling, too unrefined. And Dorothy, for the first time, was beginning to pull away. But even as her world expanded, it was never fully hers. In one particularly telling moment, during a promotional party for Galaxina, Dorothy sat between two men, Paul on her left, Peter on her right. The camera caught her smiling, but her hands were tightly folded in her lap, her shoulders pulled inward. It's a small detail, but in retrospect, it looks like a silent plea trapped between the man who made her and the one who wanted to remake her. Playboy offered Dorothy more than fame. It offered escape from poverty, from obscurity, from smallness. But escape comes at a cost. The mansion was filled with eyes. Everyone was watching. Everyone had opinions. She was no longer Dorothy from Vancouver. She was Dorothy Stratten, Playmate of the Year, a public fantasy, a private possession. One night, during a quiet dinner with friends, Dorothy reportedly said something curious. She described feeling split in half, like her life was happening in two different timelines, the one she'd imagined, and the one she was trapped inside. When someone asked her what she meant, she just laughed and changed the subject. That split, the psychological fracture, was growing. Dorothy wanted to believe in the promise Hefner had made. She wanted to be more than a muse. But even he, the architect of her stardom, could not protect her from what followed. He could close the mansion doors to Paul, but he could not close the door inside Dorothy that still opened when Paul called. She still answered his calls, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps from habit, or perhaps because part of her, however small, still remembered the boyish grin that once made her feel seen. There's an old superstition in theater: never speak aloud the name of the Scottish play. Some say it invites tragedy. In Hollywood, there are names you whisper, names that carry weight. Dorothy's became one of them. By the time she was crowned Playmate of the Year in 1980, she was glowing. Her face lit up billboards. Her name was on casting lists. And yet, those who knew her said she seemed quieter that summer. Not unhappy, but watchful, as if she were waiting for something inevitable to arrive. And somewhere, in the shadow of her rising star, Paul Snider waited too. In every great tragedy, there is a moment when the shadow overtakes the light. For Dorothy, that shadow was Paul Snider, and by the summer of 1980, he was no longer hiding behind curtains. He was pacing in the center of the stage, unraveling in plain view. At first, Paul had been the one with the plan. He had spotted Dorothy behind the Dairy Queen counter. He had styled her, photographed her, coached her on what to say. He spoke of building an empire, called her his angel. In interviews, he told friends that Dorothy was going to make them both rich, that they'd live like kings and queens, that she owed him everything. But as Dorothy began to step into her own light, Paul began to shrink. It wasn't sudden, it was the kind of corrosion that happens over time. Silently, he became erratic, more controlling. He followed her to appointments, demanded updates, checked her phone messages. When Dorothy began spending time with Peter Bogdanovich on the set of They All Laughed, Paul's jealousy turned to obsession. He bought a private detective. At a coffee shop in Westwood, Paul once sat alone with a manila envelope filled with notes, receipts, and photographs. His coffee went cold while he flipped through images of Dorothy and Peter together, smiling, walking, nothing explicit, but enough to suggest intimacy. Paul's face stayed still, but his hand trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. He didn't speak to anyone that day. He had begun to isolate himself. Friends said he'd call at odd hours, drunk or sobbing. One told police later that Paul would describe nightmares where Dorothy disappeared entirely, erased from the world without him. Another recounted how he spoke of revenge not in loud threats, but in slow, deliberate phrases. "If I can't have her," he once said, "no one will." He was also broke. After being banned from the mansion and cut out of Dorothy's contracts, Paul spiraled financially. He tried to promote events that flopped, borrowed money from acquaintances, even attempted to start a new male strip review. But every door seemed to close. In his mind, every rejection traced back to Dorothy, her success, her distance, her betrayal. He bought a shotgun, not immediately. He asked around first, casually, said it was for protection, for rats in the neighborhood. He kept it hidden, beneath the bed in the room he was renting. He practiced with it once, out at the edge of the Angeles forest. The sound echoed through the trees and startled a group of hikers nearby. They never saw him, but they remembered the echo. It sounded too close, too final. Dorothy had already begun pulling away. She had moved out of their shared home, stayed with friends, and limited her contact with Paul. She sought legal advice. She even offered Paul money quietly, privately hoping it would allow him to move on. But he refused. He didn't want to let go. Letting go would mean admitting he had lost control. In one particularly chilling moment, Paul was seen rifling through a photo album at a friend's house. It was all Dorothy early shoots, magazine spreads, Polaroids. He ran his finger along the edge of her face in one photo and murmured, "She was perfect." And then she started thinking for herself. By August, Paul had grown pale and thin. He barely left the house. Neighbors said the lights stayed on all night. The TV played static at dawn. Mail piled up unread. He answered the door shirtless, with bruises on his arms and a strange calm in his voice. Some say he was planning everything. Others believe he simply lost himself. piece by piece, until nothing was left but the final decision. But one thing is certain: Paul Snider didn't just kill out of rage. He killed to possess something one last time. In his twisted logic, if he couldn't control Dorothy in life, he would control the memory of her death. A week before the murder, he sent a bouquet of red roses to her new address. No note, just petals, fresh and thorned. The flowers were never thrown away. Dorothy placed them in a vase on the kitchen table. She looked at them for days, perhaps wondering what they meant, perhaps knowing exactly. There was a moment, suspended in the heat of a Los Angeles summer, where a woman stood between two men, both powerful in their own right, both believing they knew what was best for her. One had discovered her. The other, she thought, might save her. And somewhere in the fragile space between them, Dorothy Stratten tried to find herself. Peter Bogdanovich had met Dorothy on the set of They All Laughed, a wistful film about love and miscommunication. He was a respected director, once hailed as Hollywood's next great auteur. She was young, untrained, but arresting in front of the camera. Their connection had an ease neither expected. He would later say he fell in love not just with her face, but with the light behind her face. Peter was 40. Dorothy was barely 20. Their affair was quiet, at first unofficial, unconfirmed. But it was real. In letters and conversations with close friends, Dorothy described feeling seen. "Peter listens to me," she said once, "not like Paul. He doesn't just wait for me to stop talking." But Dorothy was still legally married. Paul was still present, lurking at the edges of every page of her life, even as she rehearsed lines and attended rap parties. He called her constantly, left notes at her door, showed up uninvited. She tried to handle it gently, perhaps too gently. Peter urged her to break contact. "You owe him nothing," he told her. But Dorothy wasn't ready, or maybe she was afraid. She still used words like polite and obligation, still left the door cracked open. Paul slipped through it again and again. It was Hefner who noticed the shift. Hugh, who had once seen Paul as a necessary middleman, now viewed him as a threat. He told Dorothy not to see him. He spoke to Peter about offering her protection, legal support, anything she needed. Behind closed doors, these two men, Hefner and Bogdanovich, discussed her like a fragile figure, precious and precarious, as if she might shatter at any moment. And yet, neither of them could agree on what she needed most. Hefner wanted her back in the safety of the mansion, among familiar routines. Peter wanted her far away from all of it, out of the spotlight, out of the magazines, beginning again as a serious actress. And Paul just wanted her still. The triangle wasn't love. It was control, disguised as concern. Dorothy, by now, was quiet. She gave short interviews, posed for final photos. In one, taken just days before her death. She stands in a studio kitchen holding a mug of tea. Her expression is serene, but unreadable. There is something in her eyes, like someone who knows a storm is coming and is already making peace with it. That week, she confided to a friend that she planned to speak with Paul, alone. She wanted to be kind, to offer closure. She said she didn't believe in cruelty, even to those who had been cruel. "He won't hurt me," she said. "I just want to end things the right way." Peter begged her not to go, but Dorothy insisted. "It's just a conversation." She said, "I want to be fair. There's a story, a quiet one, that Peter sat up that night, unable to sleep, convinced something was going to happen. He reportedly called her apartment twice. No answer. He told a friend the next morning, "I should have driven over. I should have stopped it." But it was already in motion. These three men, Hefner, Bogdanovich, Snider, each believed they understood her. Each believed they could guide her, help her, save her. And yet none could see the full truth that Dorothy, caught between them, was trying to write her own script. one that didn't end with tragedy. In the days that followed, Peter would become a ghost of himself. He disappeared from public view, stopped production on his next film, and spent hours locked in rooms with lawyers and grief. He would later publish a book about Dorothy. He would say it was to honor her, but some critics called it a monument to guilt, a way to rewrite the ending, to cast himself not as a man who couldn't stop a murder, but as the last one who loved her. And maybe both are true, because in the end, Dorothy Stratten stood between two men, one who promised a future, one who clung to the past. Neither could save her. It was August 14th, 1980. The heat clung to the city like a fever. In a quiet West Los Angeles neighborhood, Dorothy stood at the edge of a decision she had postponed too long. The morning passed gently. She wore a simple dress, cream-colored, loose at the waist, and carried a single shoulder bag. Inside it, her keys, a checkbook, a lipstick, and a folded envelope. That envelope held the money she had promised Paul. She had agreed to meet him one last time, the night before. She had stayed with a friend, a quiet safe house from the rising tension. She spoke softly over dinner, stirring a cup of tea she didn't drink. Her hands moved slower than usual, her voice gentler still. "I just want to be done with it," she said. "He needs closure. I need peace." She repeated the phrase twice. Peace. Peace. As if willing the word into existence. The apartment on South Linden Drive had once been theirs, though theirs had always meant his, and she had merely moved inside it. The hallway carpet was worn, a pale beige that showed every shadow. Outside, the rose bushes she had planted were beginning to wilt. Dorothy had not lived there in weeks, but she still had a key. She did not tell anyone exactly what time she planned to arrive. In a nearby parking lot, her car sat in the sun, its interior scorching. On the passenger seat, a pair of sunglasses and a stack of scripts bound in blue. The rolls weren't large, but they were hers. Dorothy had begun to mark the pages with notes, tiny handwritten edits in the margins. "Smile less here," she wrote on one. "Try stillness instead of fear." Inside the apartment, Paul waited. He had showered, shaved, and laid out photographs on the table. Images of her, clippings from magazines, fan letters, promotional stills. He had taped some of them to the walls. They watched him silently, their expressions frozen in poses he had memorized. He had dressed carefully. White shirt, jeans, the belt buckle polished. He had loaded the shotgun that morning. Neighbors would later testify that they heard nothing. No shouting, no struggle, just the faint hum of a fan. One recalled hearing music, an old Elton John record, warped slightly as it played too slowly. "Someone saved my life tonight." Dorothy walked up the steps around noon. She was holding a manila envelope. Inside it, $1,000 in cash, a receipt from her lawyer, and a note outlining the division of property. She had written it by hand, not out of obligation, out of grace. Some say she hesitated before unlocking the door. It was not the first time she had tried to leave Paul. She had made escape plans before quietly, carefully, each one unraveling in guilt or fear. But this time was different. She had another man, a possible future, a taste of what independence could feel like. And she believed, perhaps naively, that kindness could ease the transition. But Paul had not come to talk. The clock on the mantel stopped at 12:23 p.m. No one knows exactly when it happened. Only that the day grew quiet, unnaturally so. The air hung heavy, unmoving. The phone on the kitchen counter remained untouched. Her sunglasses stayed on the seat of her car. Later that evening, Paul missed 2 appointments. His roommate, John, returned home and found the door locked from the inside. He knocked. No answer. He waited an hour, then another. Finally, he broke in through a window, What he saw would never leave him. Dorothy lay on the floor of the bedroom, her face turned gently to one side. She had been shot in the face at close range, then violated after death. Paul lay next to her shirtless, a gun in his hand, a second wound beneath his chin. The bedspread was stained. The walls were speckled. The mirror across from the bed had been covered with a towel. Even in death, he didn't want to see himself. The manila envelope was missing. The money gone. Dorothy's handbag emptied on the kitchen floor. Its contents scattered, lipstick rolled beneath the counter. Checkbook torn. Her shoes were off, neatly placed beside the couch, as if she had entered gently, still believing she could leave that way. There is something unbearable in that image, a woman who believed she could soften the rage of a man who had only ever known possession, who mistook her final act of generosity for weakness, who turned kindness into a trap. And in that quiet apartment, where the air smelled of dust and wilted roses, Dorothy Stratten's attempt to leave became the moment she could never return. The front door was unlocked when they found it the next day, but no one had heard it open. The apartment remained still, untouched by the passing hours, as if time itself had recoiled from what had taken place inside. August light filtered through the blinds in thin, vertical stripes. Dust floated in the beams, slow and indifferent. Somewhere in the corner of the room, the record had stopped turning, leaving only the soft crackle of static. Dorothy Stratten had entered the apartment to speak with Paul Snyder for what she believed would be a final, civil closure. She had told her lawyer earlier that week that she wanted to offer him money, divide assets, and finally walk away clean. "I want no bad blood," she'd said. "Just space." But Paul wasn't interested in space. Inside the bedroom, 2 bodies lay still. But this wasn't a crime of passion, it was choreography. When police arrived, they found Dorothy's body posed. She had been shot in the face with a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun. The blast was devastating, instantaneous. But it was what Paul did after that broke the pattern of mere violence. He positioned her body, posed it on the floor, placed his own near hers, and arranged the scene with perverse intention. A Polaroid camera sat nearby. One photo had been taken unrevealed, left to the air. The autopsy would later confirm the sequence. She had been killed first, then molested. Then Paul turned the gun on himself. He did not leave a note. He did not need to. The room was a message. The towel draped over the mirror was symbolic, almost ritualistic, as if Paul could not bear to face the reflection of what he had become or what he had done. Mirrors, once witnesses to Dorothy's rise, now stood blind, covered in silence. In the hallway, officers found the remains of a scrapbook, torn pages, a cover sliced down the middle, photos of Dorothy ripped, folded, some pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. In one, her face was scratched through with ink. In another, she smiled on a beach, arms outstretched, the sky wide and blue behind her. That one had been left untouched. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk as word spread. A crime scene van pulled up, lights rotating, but no sirens. There were no screams, no public hysteria, just quiet confusion. A few fans arrived by evening, some clutching magazines, some with tears they didn't quite understand. News outlets scrambled for headlines. The beautiful Playmate, the jealous husband, Hollywood tragedy. But the truth was less convenient than a tabloid banner. Dorothy had not been reckless. She had been careful. She had told friends where she was going. She had tried, in every way, to make her exit gentle. That was her flaw. She still believed in kindness. Peter Bogdanovich collapsed when he heard. He had spent the day trying to reach her. When the news broke, he locked himself in a room for hours. Friends found him staring at a blank wall, unmoving. He did not speak. He simply asked for silence. Hefner was stunned. but less surprised. He later told a reporter, "She was too gentle for this world. That man should never have been allowed near her." But the mansion kept its parties going. The music played. The girls smiled. Life in Hollywood does not pause. It only redirects. Dorothy's mother arrived in El Douair the following week. She wore dark glasses and a thin scarf, gripping a photo of Dorothy from her high school graduation. She was led past reporters into a back entrance of the coroner's office. When asked if she wanted a public funeral, she shook her head. She was a girl. She said simply, "Not a story." But Dorothy had already become a story, one that would outlive headlines, outlive scandal, outlive even justice. A story of how beauty can be mistaken for silence, and how silence can be mistaken for consent. In the hours before her death, Dorothy had reportedly rehearsed lines from a script. It was a small part. She had written notes in the margins, underlined a single line. "I just want to be free." It is hard not to read that as prophecy. And somewhere, in that apartment filled with echoes, her last appointment became the final rewrite of a script she never got to finish. The coroner's report was clinical, methodical, indifferent. It listed time of death, cause, positioning of the body, measurements of the wounds. But nothing in that sterile language could capture the way the room felt. The officers who stepped inside said the air was thick like syrup coated in heat, and something else. Something that clung to the throat. Dorothy had died in what was once the bedroom she shared with Paul. A modest space, beige carpet, cream walls, a mattress with no frame. One wall had been painted white not long before, an attempt, perhaps, at renewal. Now it bore the aftermath of the shotgun's blast, a halo of red and bone that left its mark like a closing signature. The image was unforgettable. A young woman, poised even in death. Her body arranged deliberately grotesquely in a pose that mimicked rest. Her hair was matted with blood. A single shoe remained on her foot. The other had landed several feet away, as if kicked off in sudden movement. Her arm was bent behind her, unnaturally. Her eyes had been closed, but not by her. The police didn't speak much inside the room. The stillness was oppressive. The only sounds were the faint tick of a wristwatch left on the nightstand, and the soft mechanical buzz of the Polaroid camera still humming on the floor. Paul's body lay slumped against the mirrored closet doors, a red bloom beneath his chin. He had stripped off his shirt, as if preparing for something ceremonial. His skin was slick with sweat. The shotgun rested between his legs, barrel tilted backward, stock planted against the ground. A single spent shell glinted like a copper insect on the carpet. In the corner sat the manila envelope, finally recovered. The money inside was still folded neatly, untouched. It hadn't been about the money. It never was. The responding detective later described the scene as too clean and too chaotic at once, as if it had been staged, as if Paul, in his final act, wanted the narrative to read a certain way. This wasn't a crime of heat. It was cold theater. There were no signs of a struggle. No screams had been heard, no calls placed. Dorothy had likely died within moments of entering. The autopsy revealed no defensive wounds. It's possible she never even saw the gun. And yet, the room told a different story. The placement of her body, the disarray of objects in the living room, her purse overturned, lipstick crushed underfoot, a script torn at the corner. Small things, symbolic things, a theater of control. Outside, the world continued unaware. The sun baked the sidewalk. Children played across the street. A dog barked at nothing in the distance. The mundanity of the afternoon made the violence inside even more obscene. News of her death traveled fast. Wire services carried the headline, "Playmate slain in apparent murder-suicide." Her photo appeared on every major paper the next morning. A cropped image from her Playmate of the Year spread. Smiling. Perfect. framed. But what didn't fit into the headline was the mood of that white wall. The way it absorbed everything: blood, smoke, memory. The way it stood unbroken after the blast, as if bearing silent witness to the unspeakable. Peter Bogdanovich arrived 2 days later to collect her things. The apartment had already been cleared by police, the bed removed, the carpet scrubbed. But the smell lingered: cleaning agents and something metallic beneath. He walked through the room slowly, touching items as if they might still be warm: a paperback novel on the windowsill, a comb, a ring dish. He stopped at the wall, touched it once, then turned away. The case was quickly closed. No trial, no grand unraveling. The motive, everyone agreed, was jealousy, obsession, a man left behind. But those words flattened the story, made it manageable, neat. What remains harder to name is what Dorothy became in death. Not just a victim, not just a cautionary tale, but a symbol of how easily the world confuses possession with love, and how women, even in their final moments, are staged like dolls for the convenience of others' grief. The white wall was eventually repainted. New tenants moved in. The stains faded, the headlines passed. But for those who saw it, who truly saw what was left behind, it never quite vanished. Because blood, when dried on something pristine, never goes invisible. It lingers like a memory too sharp to look at, but too heavy to forget. Arbor. In the months that followed Dorothy Stratten's death, Peter Bogdanovich stopped speaking to most of his friends. He locked himself away in a rented home in Bel Air, where the curtains were drawn tight and the phone went unanswered. He couldn't bear to look at the papers, couldn't stand the radio. Every mention of her name was like reanimating a wound that refused to clot. The director who once mingled with Orson Welles, whose films defined a generation, now paced rooms in silence, haunted by a presence that no longer had breath. There was a quiet obsession to his grief. He read and reread her letters, watched old dailies from They All Laughed until the reels wore thin. He traced her lines with his finger on the screen, paused frames where she looked happiest, stared into the flickering light as if it could speak back. He began to collect every photograph, every scrap of her handwriting, even receipts from dinners they once shared. He cataloged her. Some said it was love. Others said it was something else, something darker. 3 months later, he self-published a book, The Killing of the Unicorn. Dorothy Stratten, 1960-1980. Part memoir, part polemic. It was Peter's howl into the void. In it, he blamed Hugh Hefner, the Playboy culture, the commodification of beauty, and a society that turned young women into objects, then walked away when they shattered. He didn't spare himself, but he placed himself carefully in the story. As protector, as lover, as survivor. The book was divisive. Critics called it self-serving. Readers whispered that grief had distorted his sense of boundaries. Others admired its rawness, its fury. But underneath the prose was something unmistakable. A man reconstructing a woman from fragments, trying to preserve what had already slipped through his fingers. Peter retreated further into Dorothy's shadow. He paid off her mother's mortgage, helped support her younger siblings. He moved into a house with Dorothy's mother and sister, trying to keep the remnants of her life near. Some found it touching, others unsettling. Years later, he would marry Dorothy's sister, Louise. They were together for over a decade. Peter also attempted to resurrect They All Laughed, the film that had brought him and Dorothy together. Studios rejected it in the wake of the tragedy. No one wanted the taint of her death, so he bought the rights himself, mortgaged his future, released it independently. He believed, perhaps desperately, that the film held the last pure image of her, the woman she was becoming, the woman who had not yet been silenced. In one scene, Dorothy walks through Manhattan in a white dress, laughing into the wind. The camera lingers not with lust, but with longing, as if trying to memorize her. Peter often said that scene wasn't acting. That was just her, he whispered in an interview years later. The real her. Free. But the more he tried to immortalize her, the more she slipped into mythology. Dorothy Stratten became a symbol of lost potential, of toxic love, of the perils of fame. Everyone who spoke of her seemed to own a different version. The angelic playmate, the Hollywood ingenue, the girl who was too soft for the world, the woman who never had the chance to become one. And Peter remained at the center, half priest, half widower, presiding over her legacy with a reverence that made some uncomfortable. In truth, grief can be possessive. It can disguise itself as devotion while tightening into something unyielding. Peter's pain was real, but it was also sculpted, edited, filmed. He made her memory into a kind of shrine, and in doing so, perhaps he froze her just as Paul did, but by different means, because Dorothy had no voice in what came next. No say in the book, no say in the film, no say in who claimed her story. She had been taken from the world in violence. But in mourning, she was taken again, transformed into reflection, memory, projection, a mirror held up not just to Peter's loss, but to the deep, unrelenting hunger for purity in a world that never stops consuming beauty. A unicorn, he called her. Rare, magical, fragile. But unicorns don't exist. Dorothy did, briefly, brightly, with a pulse and a mind and dreams not yet formed. And maybe the real tragedy is that she never got to write her own ending. Others wrote it for her. Long after the newspapers stopped printing her name, Dorothy Stratten lingered in the air of Hollywood like a perfume that couldn't be washed out. Not with time, not with distance. She became a story people told each other in low voices, always with that same sigh at the end. She was so young, so beautiful, so tragic. But those words do something subtle. They shrink her. They pin her into a frame. They make her a myth, instead of a girl who once stood barefoot in the early morning light, pressing her fingertips to a mirror, wondering what her life might become. Her image, though, refused to fade. There's something uncanny about how her face has survived. It floats through documentaries, crime anthologies, lists of stars gone too soon. It's in slow-motion clips, black and white close-ups, blurred reenactments. Always the same. The golden hair, the half-smile, the eyes that seem to search just beyond the camera. And in that repetition, something eerie occurs. She becomes less a person, more an echo, a ghost with perfect posture. Even today, search her name and the same photos return, over and over. She is frozen in them, eternally 20, eternally lovely, never allowed to age. Her story stops in 1980, but the world keeps moving, dragging her behind like a shadow. Peter Bogdanovich would continue to speak of her for decades, often with reverence, sometimes with bitterness. In interviews, he called her a victim of men's fantasies, a casualty of the times, the most important person in his life. He never fully recovered, and in a strange, mournful twist, he never seemed to want to. Hugh Hefner, too, would speak of Dorothy with regret, framing her death as a lesson in lost innocence. Yet the machine of Playboy continued on, still printing images of idealized women, still trading in the same currency that once consumed Dorothy's youth. There's a particular kind of grief reserved for lives interrupted at their beginning. It's different from the grief of the old. It carries a sharper edge because of what never got to unfold. Dorothy never became the woman she might have been. We are left with only glimpses, handwritten notes in the margins of scripts, her voice captured in scratchy audio reels, flickers of uncertainty in her eyes during interviews. And so the world filled in the blanks, with elegies, with judgment, with obsession. But Dorothy wasn't just a symbol. She was a girl who loved books, who once wanted to study medicine, who adored her little sister and wrote letters home that ended with hearts and smiley faces, who found it difficult to raise her voice, even when afraid, who brought flowers to a man who had threatened her because part of her still believed kindness could heal. She was a person, which makes what happened to her not just tragic, but monstrous. The spotlight is a seductive thing. It flatters, warms, rewards, but it also burns. And in Dorothy's case, it concealed the shadows creeping in behind her. By the time people noticed, it was already too late. In 1983, her life was adapted into a film, Star 80, directed by Bob Fosse. It was brutal, stylized, controversial. Critics praised its rawness, condemned its exploitation. But even in that depiction, Dorothy's voice was filtered through others. Men wrote her lines. Men decided how she died on screen. The real Dorothy, soft-spoken, shy, privately funny, was barely visible beneath the stylized sheen. And yet, her presence endures. Maybe that's the strange punishment of being remembered for how you died. The end becomes everything. It overshadows the middle, erases the start. But sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the soft parts of Dorothy's story. Not the headlines, not the flashbulbs, but the quiet breaths between her lines, the gentle awkwardness in early screen tests, the way she blinked when nervous. She was real, and somewhere, out beyond the lights, beyond the camera, beyond the stage that took her in and spit her out, that realness waits, soft as a whisper, sharp as a warning. Dorothy Stratten will never grow old, but she will also never be truly gone, because every time her face reappears on screen, in a photo, in a stranger's memory, she returns, not as a myth, not as a martyr, but as a ghost in the spotlight, watching